I think that children can absolutely thrive, meet their nutritional needs on an exclusively plant-based diet, and it does require some planning and focus on specific nutrients.
Welcome to Roots of Healing, the podcast where we cover the stories, insights, and ideas shaping the future of lifestyle and integrative medicine. I'm your host, Dr. Siri Chand Khalsa, a physician and advocate for holistic healing and embodied living. Before we begin, please note that this podcast is for educational and informational purposes only. The views expressed by the guests are their own and do not constitute medical advice. Always consult your healthcare provider for personal medical concerns. Each week, I have the privilege of sitting down with trailblazers and thought leaders who are reimagining what it means to heal mind, body, and spirit. Together, we'll share their journeys, innovative approaches, and the deeper roots of healing that inspire us all. Let's dive in this week with Dr. Reshma Shah, a pediatrician, parent coach, and award-winning author of Nourish, of which I'm a personal fan, the definitive plant-based nutrition guide for families. As a contributing author to the American Academy of Pediatrics Pediatric Nutrition Textbook and co-director of the Learning Center at Plant-Based Juniors, she provides evidence-based nutrition education for healthcare professionals and parents. Having previously served as an affiliate clinical instructor at Stanford University School of Medicine, Dr. Shah now teaches for Stanford's Be Well program, which we're going to want to hear all about. Through her parent coaching practice, she guides family through general parenting challenges, new medical diagnoses, feeding concerns, and plant-based nutrition with empathy and expertise. A parent of 2 young adults, Dr. Shah lives in the Bay Area, where she finds weekly inspiration at her local farmers market, which we also share a deep and abiding love for. Thank you so much, Dr. Shah, and we're so excited to have you visit us this week.
Well, it's such an honor to be here, and I think one day we will have to hit the farmers market together.
Oh, gosh, yeah. If you haven't had a chance to view Dr. Shah's beautiful book, Nourish, I can tell you she is a firm lover of vegan and plant-forward, plant-based living. And I'd love for you to just tell us a little bit about how did you come to that intersection in your own medical career? Did you start your training as a plant-based focus, or was that something that came as you were working with patients and exploring your own life?
It was not even on my radar when I started my clinical training. It's interesting because I feel like I've had a little bit of a full circle journey around plant-based, plant-forward eating. I grew up in an Indian household, and I was vegetarian growing up. So it wasn't necessarily like a new way, I've heard so many people that have gone plant-based that talk about having grown up on a dairy farm or having meat and potatoes for, dinner every night. That was not my case, but we were an immigrant family, and I think more than anything, I just wanted to sort of fit in. And I remember vividly thinking, like, why can't we just have like meatloaf and mashed potatoes like everybody else? So for most of my young adult life, I don't think I really paid much attention to food at all, to tell you the truth. It was about convenience. And, during our medical education and training, it's really like whatever they're serving in the cafeteria, whatever you can get when you're on call. I don't ever really remember getting much nutrition education in medical school or definitely not in residency. And selfishly, I think the shift began to happen for me when I started having kids. I had my first child at the end of residency, and I think that I was just in a bit of chaos. Like, we were, a busy working family, and I think I just had this realization, like, I am responsible for the health and well-being of these little beings. I better sort of figure out what I should be doing. And so it was really, during being a young attending that I started to be more interested in nutrition, initially just for myself and my family and my children. And then the more I learned about it, the more I wanted to sort of find simple strategies to be able to have these conversations with my patients. And so that was really the beginning. And then I kind of went down that rabbit hole, and, 20 years later, here I am.
It really is so illuminating to hear about someone who has really worked clinically and seen problems that are difficult to solve, and then seeing the impact that subtle, strong, and persistent, one could say persistent more than anything, changes in diet can actually impact the outcome and severity of a disease course. Did you start noticing that when you recommended it to patients, or was it really initially for you, then it kind of slowly spilled into practice? What was that? Was there some internal pressure around that for a while?
I think, in the beginning, it was purely selfish. It was like, what can I do to make dinner time more manageable in my own house? And I think that what I was really surprised by, for most of my career, I've worked in sort of low income, under resourced communities. And sometimes it can feel daunting or overwhelming to have these conversations in that context because, there's so many complex issues from food and nutrition insecurity to all the other economic, financial challenges that a lot of these families face. And so I think I was a little nervous to have some of those conversations in the beginning. I think what I was most surprised by was that the families were interested. And even though they may not have the resources to shop at, Whole Foods or buy organic things, they were very much interested in having the conversations. And I think it was a big lesson in humility and sort of meeting people where they're at. Luckily in pediatrics, we don't see the manifestation of a lot of these chronic diseases at such an early age. But I think there was sort of a few key patient interactions that really allowed me to believe that our patients deserve these conversations. They're interested in these conversations, and you should never underestimate what they might be interested in exploring. So,
yeah. Isn't that the truth, right? A little bit of curiosity and motivational interviewing. And I think the other piece is, this is such an intangible part of it, but it's easier to, oftentimes you'll see a clinician who has that kind of do as I say, not as I do. But when someone is really embodying it themselves, I found, and I'm curious what you found supervising residents, that when you do it yourself, you actually know the questions that someone might have, and you can frame that into how you offer information versus someone who isn't doing it. It's like, so for example, I may not be that good at giving exercise recommendations because my exercise focus is really just in one lane, right? I do the recumbent bike, but there are so many ways to talk to people about exercise, but I can't really talk about them. When it comes to food, obviously we share that, but I'm curious if you found that to be the case.
yeah, and I think it's interesting that you sort of mention the residents and medical students because I've worked extensively with students and residents, and I think food is one of those topics that they're definitely relevant at the patient level, but I think it's equally relevant at the educational level. Like I think as eager and interested as the families were, I think the residents and students are even more interested because it's got sort of a dual purpose for their own individual health, for the health of their family or friends or community members, but also they want to be able to effectively talk to patients about this. And I think it's one of the reasons I love talking about food because there's so many facets to it and it's such a connector. And so definitely having some experience with food in terms of the background nutrition information and knowing, what some of the evidence supports and what a healthy dietary pattern is, but also the very practical aspects of like, I've got 2 kids and a busy household, and how do I get dinner on the table in 20 minutes that is somewhat healthy, that the kids are going to eat, and that fits within my budget. So being able to have that sort of practical experience with food, I think is incredibly helpful. And it's really easy to say, just eat healthier, but to be able to talk to a patient and say, walk me through some of the things that you love to eat and what are some shifts or some changes. I really believe in sort of like a meeting people where they're at and an add-in approach. I always try to add things before I ask people to give things up because I think with food, it's really hard to go at it from an approach where people feel deprived or,
For sure. Restricting tends to create, at least in my experience, a binging or, large scale, like, especially where we're having this conversation in the new year when a lot of resolutions are there and it's veganary, there's a lot of initiative in January, but then comes Valentine's Day and the Super Bowl and then comes spring and then all the barbecue. It has a sort of seasonal quality where people can maintain it for a shorter period. I'm curious, so you tell us a little bit about your career. So you went through a traditional, I myself also had next to no nutritional training. So we're a little bit older, mature physicians, as I like to say. I think
Experienced, wise.
yes. And I always say, my age because I didn't have work hours. So, work hour restrictions, that's like tells you a lot.
Benchmark.
But yeah, benchmark. But I think that, curriculums have changed, and I've certainly contributed to writing some curriculum in nutrition that's part of some of the integrative medicine curricula. It's available at a lot of training centers now. What are some things that you found in your training process that helped you deepen in this knowledge? So you finished your classic residency training with almost no training. Then you got to a certain intersection where you said, well, I'm talking and I see the value of this, but I want to incorporate it. Where did you go then to learn? And what was that process like?
Yeah, and it was a little daunting because I think, I'm like I always say I could be a student for life. I'm used to formal education and lots of degrees and all that stuff. And so I think for the first time, like there wasn't a clear path, like you check off these boxes and you take this test and then you're done. So for me, it was initially just sort of like reading on my own in isolation. And then when we moved to California, I sort of took a little bit of a break clinically while I sorted out my license and all of that. And I sort of kind of became a professional student again in a very different way. So I started going to medical conferences. I actually took a 6-month long professional, it was a virtual, but a professional cooking course to get certified in cooking plant-based nutrition, plant-based foods. And I think a lot of it was just going to conferences, reading. I don't think there was any really formal path. And I will tell you, if you want to learn something, a really good way to do it is to write a book about it. So that was definitely, and I did that. I wrote Nourish in collaboration with Brenda Davis, who is a wealth of knowledge. And so she's been a great resource and a teacher for me, but consolidating my ideas. And I am a physician who is interested in nutrition. I'm by no means a nutrition expert. And so I'm very clear to sort of stay in my lane of expertise. And the thing that I really hope to sort of offer people is, I have this background and foundational knowledge of nutrition. I'm not a dietitian, but piecing that together with some of the more clinical aspects and also some of the parenting challenges, that intersection of clinical expertise, having some information about food and nutrition, and the real life family challenges, whether it's dealing with picky eaters or knowing how to prepare a meal or trying to stay, within budget or time constraints. So I feel like maybe I'm like a little bit of a jack of all trades, master of none, but I think I know enough to also, I think one of the things that comes with maturity and wisdom is I don't feel like I have to be an expert in everything. I know when to say, that's interesting. I'll get back to you on that.
Yeah, that's the beauty of getting older. I couldn't agree more. The mature phase of life it has a sort of settledness in what we know and don't know. And there's a quality of being able to surrender and be content in what we don't know versus I definitely agree. Being younger, we're like, I must be able to answer every question. And even if you're like answering it, looking it up at the same time, right? I'm sure we've all done that. Yes, we're making small talk as we're looking up the answer. And the amount of knowledge that one needs these days is so vast, finding these integrations with resources like online communities, coaching. I think nutrition is such a multidisciplinary, multifaceted conversation. And Nourish is actually one of my favorite words. And so I don't begrudge you that that's the name of your book, but it's always been a term that I have also personally a real affinity to because nourishment indicates a little bit more than just purely macro distributions. I'd love to hear what does the word nourish mean to you and why did you pick that as the title?
Yeah. Well, thank you for noticing that. I think the title was really important to me. And I think pretty much as soon as I sort of started drafting the outline for the book, the title of Nourish was there for me because I think, as you mentioned, I think it can have so many different meanings, like nourish from nourishment in terms of nutrients and meeting our nutrient requirements. That's definitely there. But I think at the level of feeding your family, it's also about like the love and the care that goes into it, the connection. And one of the things that I try to emphasize is that it is about the food that shows up on our dinner tables, but it's also about what goes on around our dinner tables, how we connect, how we relate to food, how we share stories, how we are connected. And I think, food to me is really an expression of love in a lot of ways. And so I think that word nourish really encompasses all of that. And the way we sort of broke out the book or divided the book was, there was definitely the technical aspects, like if you want to know about specific nutrients, but we also wanted to address some of the topics, for instance, around like responsive feeding and not being, especially with children, overly restrictive in your approach. I think language is really important in how we approach these topics. So I wanted to sort of find a word that encompassed all of that.
That's so beautiful. And I think, there's so many layers in that, right? We want to just recognize how powerful that is. Tell me a little bit about the book writing process. Get a little more granular in that. How did you go about doing that?
Well, I think one of the things I've discovered about myself in this more mature phase is that I really love when I'm learning to figure something out. So it's been really fascinating in this second phase of my career to be sort of more project oriented and working on projects. And the book was definitely one of the biggest projects I've ever done. I met Brenda Davis at a conference many years ago, and I just so happened to be sitting next to her on a flight from San Francisco to LA. And she's such a humble, kind, sweet person. And I knew exactly who she was. I'm like, I'm sitting next to Brenda Davis on the plane. And, we started chit-chatting and we just immediately clicked. And she offered me a ride to the hotel. She's like, because we were having such a good time chatting, and she was one of the speakers at the conference. And so she had a car picking her up. And she said, well, why don't you just, would you like to join me in the car? And I said, yes, I would like to join you in the car. And we just, ended up really hitting it off immediately. And we stayed in touch through the course of the year. And then the following year, I met her at the same conference, and I was looking for something a little bit more. I knew that I wanted to do something more than just giving occasional talks. And I had this idea for a book. And as I was talking to her, I said, I wouldn't even know where to begin. And she said, well, we could do it together. And I was just like, I couldn't even believe that she wanted to sort of share in this project. And I remember very vividly, I was sitting at the airport waiting for my flight home, and I whipped out a notebook and I drafted the outline for the book right there. And so that's kind of how the book came to be. And then the process was so collaborative and it was a nurturing, very nourishing process. I think that Brenda, this was her like 11th book that she's written. So she's sort of a pro at the book writing process. But I was really keen to get sort of a larger audience. I wanted sort of not necessarily a vegan publisher. And so I went to like a book publishing conference, found an agent, pitched it to publishers, and, we found a publisher that was excited to take on the project. And then, writing a book proposal was an enormous effort. I didn't realize how much was involved in that whole process, but I learned a lot, and it was an incredibly interesting process as well. And then as far as the actual writing, we both had our areas that we were really passionate to talk about. I think for Brenda, like focusing on the specific nutrients and, she's just like an encyclopedia of knowledge. So she took on the sort of macro micronutrient chapters, and I took on the sort of more, family-based around the table. And we basically each had our chapters that we were primarily responsible for, but that we would just sort of send the drafts back as many times as we needed to one another, back and forth, until we got it just right. So that was a lot of information, but that's kind of how it went.
Well, and I think that, again, it sort of embodies this idea you introduced a little bit ago, which is that we don't necessarily have to carry it all ourselves. And again, that clinician mindset, physicians particularly, or PAs, nurse practitioners who are in the pediatric, family practice, internal medicine, we know how busy, especially if you're working in under-resourced areas, how busy those clinics can be and how busy the people coming to see you can be. They may have multi-generational families, limited budgets, extended work hours, things that are very precariously balanced. And we're trying to introduce new ideas, sometimes that stepwise, but also in that collaborative spirit, sometimes hearing it from more than one person, different educational formats. And I think it's so valuable to think about one person might learn well at a conference, another might do well with a book or a podcast, or they may do well just through experimentation and social media or through trusted sources. What are the ways in which writing the book surprised you about your own style of learning? Was there something that you've alluded to being like a lifelong learner? Was there something that surprised you as you were going through culling all this data together?
I think that it was initially it was a little overwhelming to like look at all the research and try to sort of like discern like what is the truth of all of this. And I think for me, one of my big takeaways is like to be very sort of nuanced and discerning in your approach. And, throughout the book, we really tried to be intentional about our language, about, because I think a lot of times like clickbait stuff is going to sell well. So if I can promise you a 30-day solution or the one thing that's going to, cure you. And we were very keen on like using the evidence to the best of our ability, stating what we know, and really being upfront about, where we may not have all the answers. And so I think for me, just like how nuanced it has to be sometimes. And also like, this is very hard as a clinician, like the idea that you might not always have the answers and that you could, but the flip side of that is we have enough information where you can still make informed choices. It's not like we should just throw our hands up in the air and say, well, we just can't know anything for sure. And that's not the case as well. But I think just like how much information there is, having to sort of find a systematic approach to sort of going through it, and then pulling it together in a way that flows, and that really, the way I like to envision it, whether it's through creating courses or writing the book, is like I really want it to feel like I'm walking the reader through a process rather than them having to sort of figure it out themselves. But I think earning the trust of the reader is really, really important right from the get-go.
That's a really great insight for our budding writers. Earning the trust of the reader is so important, right? We don't want to put all this beautiful labor into something in half a chapter in the first, they set it down to never pick it up again. That would be a real travesty. I'm curious, and again, I myself, the listeners probably know by now, I'm not a pediatrician. I'm not family practice. I don't have kids. All the pieces around what it takes to like make a beautiful human are a bit obscure to me, but I'd love for you to give maybe an introduction to your philosophy around creating a plant-based lifestyle or plant-forward lifestyle that meets the nutrient needs of a child. I'm sure this is the pushback point, right? Can a plant-based diet meet the nutritional needs of a growing child? And we know how we feel about it, but I would love for someone who might be more skeptical or who's even heard something quite contradictory from a social media source or even another clinician. What are some ways that you like to speak to that?
Yeah. So I think I always like to take the least controversial stance, in the sense that, there are extremes on both ends. On one end of the spectrum, there are people that believe that children absolutely should not be eating a plant-based, vegetarian, or, God forbid, a vegan diet. And then there are people on the other end of the spectrum who feel that as long as you eat a variety of foods, you're perfectly fine and you don't have to worry. Whole food, plant-based all the way, and you don't really have to be worried about anything in between. And I think that the truth lies somewhere in the middle. I think that children can absolutely thrive, meet their nutritional needs on an exclusively plant-based diet, and it does require some planning and focus on specific nutrients. And I think the way that I've had these conversations with families come in sort of two buckets. One is families that are already plant-based, either, they're eating a vegan diet or mostly a plant-based diet, and they want to make sure that their children are getting their nutritional needs met. And then the second bucket would be, omnivorous families that want to sort of move in the direction of being more plant-based. But, I think there's room for all of those. I once heard at a conference, the speaker said, you want to make the tent as big as possible. And that really left an impression on me. I always like to make the tent as big as possible. One of the things that I often reflect on is that for the vast majority of my career, I would say 99% of the patients that I've cared for have been omnivorous. And I have seen lots of nutrient deficiencies. I've seen iron deficiency. I've seen growth faltering. I've seen rickets due to vitamin D deficiency. I've seen a lot of nutrient deficiencies. And all of these children were following an omnivorous diet. And so my perspective as a pediatrician is all diets for children need some thought and planning. And regardless of where you fall on the plant-based spectrum, you need to be focused on specific nutrients that are challenging for a lot of children to meet if they're not consuming specific types of foods, fortified foods, or in some instances, taking supplements. So I think it's the same principles for all kids, regardless of the diet that they're following. And we know, the dietary guidelines, they have this wonderful graphic that shows the healthy eating index score, which is a score from 0 to 100 that, they measure a variety of things to say, how closely are you approximating sort of a healthy eating pattern? Most children in the United States, their diets are definitely not optimal, but they fall in this sort of almost close to poor category. So I think all children's diets need attention and care and focus. And also, it's true that if you have a child that's eating a plant-exclusive or vegan diet, there are one or two nutrients that are especially important. But it's definitely not a barrier to eating this way. It just means that, you just have to plan a little bit.
I think that's such a good insight. And I found that that's kind of like what I call the kitchen table wisdom, meaning it's realistic. It meets people in a it's almost like a trauma-informed way, but I know we've put these terms around so loosely, but it's really about understanding that people's relationship to food is so deep. And it's one of the longest relationships we have in our life is maybe breath and food. The parents may ultimately leave us and spouses come at different intersections, but this conversation we're having with food is happening from when we were smearing it on our face to when we have children sitting at the table with us. And I find that so many things inform people's perceptions and beliefs and thoughts. And I know that you've taken a transition out of your clinical picture into more of a coaching model. And I'd love for you to explain to us what prompted that, and then what exactly is coaching and why would it be so valuable?
Yeah. Well, I think that I was sort of ready to do something a little bit different. I actually left clinical practice right during the pandemic. There were a lot of changes happening, and I'd been thinking about it for some time. Our book had just come out, and I think I just was ready to sort of shift gears. And so when I stopped working in a clinical setting, I did a variety of things. The book came out. I worked with the team at Plant-Based Juniors, and we created nutrition curriculum for health professionals and for parents as well. And as those projects were coming to an end, I was sort of thinking about what's the next chapter and what is it that I want to be doing. And one of the things that I was actually kind of quite surprised by was that I missed working with families, and I missed just talking to parents. And so I knew I didn't want to go back to clinical practice. And I thought, what would be a way that I could still work with families? And so I explored options for coaching. I did a small pilot program and worked with a small number of families. And I was surprised by how much I enjoyed it. Like, that was my experiment. The only thing I was trying to test out is is this fun? Do I think I have something valuable to offer? And in terms of what coaching looks like for me, I'm still figuring that out, in the sense that my goal is really to be a support for families. It's kind of being a pediatrician. I know that within the span of 15 to 20 minutes, there's only so much that you can cover, only so many conversations you can have. And being a parent myself, and working with some of the clients that I've worked with, it's like being able to have those sort of deeper conversations, like an hour-long conversation with your pediatrician, which most people don't have access to. I'm not providing direct medical care, so I'm not providing diagnosis or treatment or management of their conditions. But there's a lot more involved in a patient's care than just a prescription or a diagnosis. One of the families that I worked with, they were dealing with a new diagnosis in their child, and it really just shook the family. And so this child was diagnosed with celiac disease. And you can imagine the fear and the chaos and the disruption, and it just changed their entire way of feeding their family. And I know, from a clinical perspective what this means, but I also have a child who had a food allergy. And so when my child received that diagnosis, I know what it was like. There was a process of grief, of knowing that your child is going to have to manage this for the rest of their lives, knowing that it's going to change the way that you feed your family. And I wanted to give parents a space to explore that, to grieve it, and to figure out a path forward. And so, so far it's been really rewarding and really challenging. And challenging just in terms of just, figure out how best I can support families. And so I'm hoping to do more of it in 2025. And I've been surprised at how rewarding. I think it gave me back the parts of patient care that I really, really missed and that I enjoyed. I think a lot of times when clinicians talk about burnout, I rarely think it's because of their interaction with patients, interaction with families. I think it's like, I don't have enough time. I have too much charting. I have, pre-authorizations, all these things. But the actual connecting to another person and offering support, I think is probably one of the reasons most of us go into medicine.
Mm-hmm. It's so interesting, this distinction. How do you explain because many people are still trying to understand, what is this distinction? Did you have a formal coaching certification? And I'm okay if you didn't, just for the record. We have inherently, through our clinical arcs, I think, become excellent coaches, but we often don't have the time to offer that. And so I'm curious, people have different distinctions or delineations between coaching and clinical care. And I love how you sort of started that. But could you elaborate a little bit more about what role you see the coach in the clinical, maybe even in the clinical team?
Yeah, so I don't have any formal coaching training. I do have I've done some additional training in motivational interviewing, and it's interesting because I think as a pediatrician, you have your patient that is the little person in front of you, but then it's also the parents. And, so there is a lot of nuanced conversation and a lot of levels of conversation. And I actually thought about, do I need to go back and get my coaching certification? So I did what people do when they don't know what the answer is. I went to someone who has more information about this. So I met with actually a coach who helps coaches. And I think it was interesting what she had to say. She said, you have so much education, so much training. And I think the physician part of me, I always want another degree or another training. And I think that it will come in the future, but I felt one of the reasons for the pilot program was to feel like, do I have the skills? Do I have the capacity? And for me, figuring out the website and the tech has been the most challenging, but talking to patients, I've done this for 20 years. And so I feel I'm open to more. I always love to be a student. I love to go to conferences. I love getting additional training and certification. But I think for me right now, my goal is just to help support as many families as I can. And that part I feel excited and comfortable and wise enough to do.
Oh, for sure. And I think when I think about the way that I designed my schedule for a period of time, because I wanted coaching to be part of my visits and we don't really have time for it, is that I would tell my schedulers, I went down to 24 hours a week. And I told my schedulers, I'm coming in 5 days a week and I want a half hour after every patient. Now, that's not totally sustainable model.
Because you carry the burden of that in terms of your time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm not being reimbursed for that. But it was so morally injurious to me
Yeah.
to just be doing diagnosis and treatment that it was the compromise I made. And sometimes I'd have 2 or 3 patients or 4 and then a block. But I always had blocks and then segments of time so that if I was running behind because I wanted to do more coaching, then I could have that opportunity. I I think it's hard to really say what is coaching, but there is this space that comes after you've told someone, here are your labs, here is the clinical diagnosis, here is the intervention, and here's the lifestyle pieces and the internal thoughts that we need to look at that are going to actually transform you uh, from maybe getting worse in this diagnosis or perhaps even prevent progression of a sequela of this diagnosis, or in some cases, reverse this diagnosis. And that's the realm that to me, it's a little gray. I'm just, being vulnerable here. But I think that coaching is one of the most profound pieces of support that really helps people set goals, create intentions, and find methods within their lifestyle, within their belief systems that help them make that happen. And when we're just having time to say, you have diabetes or PCOS or ADHD, here's your prescription, here's the labs I need to do, here's the release I need you to sign, here's the specialist, then time's up,
Yeah.
right? Time's up. So I don't know if you found that to find yourself kind of in a continuum like that, where there was this rare time when you would have it in the patient room, you're like, I've got 5 minutes. I'm going
My
to.
best appointments were usually my last appointment before lunch, because I knew that
Exactly.
okay, it'll cut into my lunch hour, but at least there's not 2 more patients waiting after that. So that was my sweet spot. And some of my best patient encounters have been that last patient before lunch. And I think that there were many, many patients that could have benefited from that last appointment before lunch, but it just so happens that whoever was that last appointment before lunch, this has nothing to do with food, but one of the patients that I remember really vividly is a child who came in, and the mother was worried that she was depressed. And the child definitely had some symptoms of depression, but because she was my 11:30 before lunch patient, I had the chance to ask her, tell me what's going on in school. And it was just that she felt she was a minority student in a predominantly white classroom, and she just didn't feel a sense of belonging. She didn't have friendships. She didn't feel like she belonged to the school community in which she was. And, we came up with a plan of, the mom was certainly looking into possibly switching schools, but in the immediate term, it was could she join a club? Could she? And the girl's eyes lit up. She was just there was this thing I've been wanting to try. It was a special dance thing. And it's you couldn't have gotten to that place without giving the child some time to tell her story, to tell her experience. And I think one of the things I'm finding about coaching that's very different than clinical practice is I'm not as tied to the agenda. I'm not you have an ear infection and do I need antibiotics? And if the treatment, there's a series of steps. And I think in coaching, I've always loved hearing people's stories. And I think there's space and time for that. And when they share their stories with you, first of all, it's a gift. It's some of these things are so deeply personal. It's kind of hard to share that in 15 minutes. But I think that sometimes you can get to the thing underneath. Does my kid need a pill for depression? And it involves food too, the same kind of conversations.
It's really, it's such a luxury. I love that last patient. It feels like that could be an article that you could write, the last patient before lunch, like a reflective piece, because there's so much nuance in both naming how the system is structured, naming that clinicians actually want it different, but the way that these practices run, we have such incredibly limited options. And as I mentioned, my compromise wasn't sustainable, but that was what I just couldn't do it, especially as an internist. And we'd have these very advanced cases where I would say, well, if we could just look at reducing stress or getting an exercise program or looking at your community or your internal dialogue, we would see a different trajectory to your disease, or even, in the clinical space, just having more time to explore really complicated phenomena like trauma and other things that attenuate chronicity and intensity of a disease. So I'm so with you on this, and I'm enjoying watching your transition, because I think it's reasonable and it's so empathic, right? It's so much compassion. And I'm wondering, do you think that there's room for empathy in the current medical clinical model? And are you seeing that empathy piece is like the superpower of the coach? I'm just curious what you think
Well, I
about
sure
that.
hope there's room for empathy. I think there has to be, right? I think, if I can reflect even on my own experience as being a patient in a medical system, I think it doesn't really take that much to feel like you've been heard. And I think at the end of the day, what patients want, and especially what parents want, is to feel like they have someone that's on their side, that's like rooting for them, that's looking out for them, and that is going to do their very best to get them to the right place. And I think, having been a clinician for many, many years, I can understand all of the ways in which we are prohibited from being that person. But I sure hope that there has to be a spark of that in every one of us, because otherwise I think most of us would not have gotten into this field. I don't know, but I sure do hope so.
Well, I think there's definitely room for it. But do you think the coaching space gives more leeway for it, or more
for sure
expansiveness?
I think the biggest downside of coaching is, not everyone has access to that kind of resource. And I struggled with that piece for a bit, because, as I mentioned, I've always worked in sort of academic institutions, and I never really had to worry about I just saw the patients. It didn't matter to me like what they were paying, or most of my patients were on some sort of, Medicare or something, some sort of support. And so that part has been definitely a sort of a different way of shifting my mindset. And so I'm still committed to sort of medical education and, doing talks and putting out resources. And then also I want to carve out this coaching practice to sort of, at the end of the day, it also has to be sustainable for us. And I think, especially as women of our generation, it's been really difficult to say my work needs to be valued and compensated. I mean, working 24 hours working 40 hours and only getting reimbursed for 24 hours. It's not sustainable. And at the end of the day, I think for us to continue on in our work, we have to be, I'm still navigating that for myself. You can see it's a challenge for me, but I wish that coaching was widely available to all families that needed it.
And I think this is such an interesting discussion. And many of the guests on the podcast are what I call mission-driven people, where there is a delicate juxtaposition between financial objectives and being of service. And those places of tension inside us are often having conversations. It's never done, that conversation of, is this okay? Is this just? Is this, is this my dharma? Is this the best place to express my unique skills and talents? And an equivalent, someone who has perhaps more privilege of varying types, would they be reimbursed double what I'm being reimbursed? Would they never accept the payment I'm accepting? It's a very complicated series of conversations we're having between feeling independent from our punk rock youth days, because, children of the 80s definitely had that quality where the music and the politics and the culture kind of gave us the ability to do it a little differently. And I think we're in an era now where we're becoming wiser and more settled. We're more, I don't know if you're familiar with the concept of fluid versus crystallized intelligence, where when you're younger, there's sort of a more dynamic nature. And as we become more crystallized, we're mentoring and holding space and more settled in our being. And I kind of think of that as that maturation and wisdom. But I do think, and I wanted to just reiterate this, that it does sound like you've created resources that anyone could access. Can you tell us a little bit about the various ways that people can access this important knowledge that you've worked on. We mentioned the book, but I think there have been other places, certainly podcasts, but tell us a little bit about the other projects you've been part of that might be useful for people to know about.
Yeah, so certainly the curriculum that I've created with the team at Plant-Based Juniors, especially the courses for parents are, I think, very affordable. There is also like a full CME course for health professionals. And then I think it's mostly through some smaller forms of writing too. I was a contributing author for the American Academy of Pediatrics upcoming book. It's like their updated edition. I contributed to the chapter on vegetarian diets, which need a little bit of a refresh. And so it's mostly through writings. And I'm like not doing a ton of speaking, but if it's like with the medical students, like at Stanford, they have a climate elective for the medical students. And so I will often, give a talk for the residents there. And then I also do some speaking through Stanford's Be Well program. So it's part of their sort of wellness initiative. Excuse me. It's mostly attended by Stanford faculty and staff and anyone, that's a student or works there, but it's really open to any community member that wants to go. And I think I don't really deal with the cost aspect of it. They charge, but I don't think it's that much. And then, I'm sort of, my relationship with social media is a little bit, off and on. But I do try to sort of, post content that is very practical and can help people sort of move more towards a plant-based diet. And my aim there is to make the food as inviting and exciting and enticing as possible, and also to give practical strategies where you don't have to, grow your own herbs, although there's nothing wrong with that, but you don't have to, ground your own millet or whatever the case may be. It can be sort of very approachable. So those are kind of the ways.
I think we could probably do a whole symposium on nutrition and social media, right? How to do it in a way that meets people's needs in various ways, that's not shaming or judging, that invites curiosity, that brings simplicity. I mean, I struggle with that. I have a love-hate relationship with social media myself, and that it's beautiful to be able to have a place to share when something inspiring comes, but also it has, we have our own process in it with the way the algorithms work and the way people respond, or what we're hoping might be an outcome or steps someone might take from interacting with our content and they don't. So it's very complicated. Social media is not, and there's certainly no predecessor or mentor at all. We're all just figuring it out. And I think the younger generations now will have seen an arc of careers where social media is a part of it and where it isn't. And of course, I think that we could, like I said, we could do a whole podcast on the detrimental elements that come from people consuming nutritional content that is oriented towards judging, shaming, and polarizing, that doesn't really accomplish a synergistic approach to self-nourishment. And that's been a long-standing criticism of mine, that there are a lot of, even in the plant-based world, people who don't actually enjoy being in the kitchen giving a lot of advice around cooking and nutrition. And I know there's a continuum of how chefs and home cooks feel about being in the kitchen, and not everybody needs to enjoy it to do it. But I feel there's a large segment of people that could enjoy it, would enjoy it, but they're being mentored, inspired, and consuming content from people who don't. And this is a longstanding criticism of mine, because then it creates a pervasive quality that being in the kitchen is laborious or burdensome. And I think it can be a beautiful segue out of the busyness of our lives to put hands on the cutting board and touch the vegetable and the sharp blade of the knife and the sounds. I love listening to cutting celery. It's like one of my favorite things. So
sauteing onions does it for me. That's like a sizzle, But I think I think even with cooking, I think, in the beginning of when I was interested in this topic and this area, it can be sort of like, I think I felt an urgency to get people excited, and it has to be done this way. And there is that sort of softness that comes with time and with wisdom and with having done this for a while. And I think it's really about, at the end of the day, whether it's about nutrition education or cooking or a parent's approach to feeding their kid, I think it really comes down to meeting people where they're at and, again, making the tent as big as possible. So I think even for people, and, there were different phases in my life. There were times where I did not find cooking enjoyable because I was coming home from a busy day in the office and, sports practice and all this stuff. And I understand that sometimes it really is just about like getting the people fed. But there are also like rituals and practices you can do in that space that can make it a little bit more approachable. Even if it's not glorious, it can be a little bit more easeful. And I think it's just slowly you make steps in that direction. Nowadays, we're sort of empty, not sort of, we are empty nesters. And I thought for sure that we would be eating like crackers and, vegan cheese for dinner. And that has not been the case. I think I've sort of rediscovered a joy in cooking because it is a little bit more relaxed. It is a little bit more, what do I want to eat tonight for dinner? So I think as with most things in life, cooking can have its stages. And for me, in terms of working with parents, it's really understanding what their challenges are, what they're capable of doing in this moment, and leaving space for that to evolve and change.
I think that really meeting people in that space of curiosity and awareness. Do you have some practical tips that you could share with our listeners about how to create a stress-free and kind of encouraging space in the kitchen, even if they're feeling a little stressed out?
Yeah.
How to help people feel encouraged to find that?
So this is going to be maybe a surprising answer, but I think that like if a family is struggling with meal times, and especially dinner time, because that's culturally like the meal that we sort of come together, I think the first thing is not necessarily to focus on the food, but to focus on everything else. Like, how are you showing up to the dinner table? Are you on your phones? Are you curious about, one another's days? And so even before you tackle the food, make sure that the dinner table is an inviting place to be. Too often, I feel like, oftentimes dinner time is the only time that we're really like sort of having a conversation with our children. And so we want to pack every conversation in. How did that math test go? Did you clean your room? And we've got a doctor's appointment. And I think it can just be a space that kids are just like kind of dreading to come to. So my first approach is really make it an inviting place to be. Be calm in your approach and try not to bring touchy subjects to the dinner table. It's like treat it like a sacred time. And once the people are excited to come to the table, then you can sort of start to gradually phase in the nutrition pieces and the food pieces or whatever changes you might want to make. And one thing I'll sort of leave you with is one of the things that was the most powerful thing at my own dinner table was I remember this is a time when like my husband and I were both very busy with our jobs, and I like just to create some peace at the table, I had a separate meal for my husband and I, one meal for one kid, because I just wanted there to be peace. And it was just so chaotic and I felt like it was not sustainable. And so I made some dramatic changes, but I also invited my children to sort of join me in the process. And one of the rituals that I had, I only did it for a couple of weeks because after a while we got the hang of it. But one of the things that I said was, give me your wishes for the week. And it was basically an invitation for them to say, I would like to have this pasta dish, or I would like to have this tofu dish, or whatever. Give me your wishes for the week. And as much as was in my capacity, I would do my best to honor those wishes. And the flip side was, if they didn't have any wishes, which was perfectly fine, they didn't have to love everything that I made, but they were not allowed to complain about the food at the table because I spent a lot of time cooking. And it was like, it took a lot of practice. It took a lot of consistency and a lot of repetition. But it really, that one thing of everybody's eating the same meal. And I know that for some families, they do have to make accommodations because of neurodevelopmental issues or allergies and things like that. So just, within the scope of what a family can do. And really, my approach to feeding children is really, it's being caring without catering. So I'm going to honor your wishes. I'm going to do the best. I want you to really love your food and enjoy it, but I'm not making 3 different meals for one family. So I think every family is going to kind of find their way, but make the dinner table an inviting space to be. I think that's the best place to start.
That's such a beautiful sort of mindful approach. I love that. That's so important. I'm wondering, sometimes I've heard stories on the adult side of the adult in the family wants to go, and they've done perhaps a fun training and now they're plant-based, but the kids are not so into it. They want to stick with the mono diet that maybe even wasn't that healthy, but that the parent had just sort of said, this is what I can get them to eat. What are some introductory ideas once we've got a more peaceful mealtime environment for someone who wants to bring, obviously we probably can't come in like a sledgehammer, like,
I
okay,
don't
all your
recommend
treats
it.
are
I don't
gone.
recommend it. It usually backfires. And I think this could be like, this is the stuff I love talking about. And this could be a whole conversation in and of itself. But I always I think that some of the simple strategies I start with is like an add-in approach. So I think it's really hard to take away foods that people find comfort and pleasure and enjoyment in. So adding things too. So maybe you're just going to keep the same breakfast and you'll add some fresh fruit. Maybe you're going to keep the same lunch and you'll add like a little cup of lentil soup. So just adding in those foods. And this might be hard for some people to hear, but I really do think that making delicious food is the best way to convert people. So like if you're making food that tastes delicious, they're going to be more inclined to try it. So if you don't feel comfortable with cooking, you don't have to become Martha Stewart, but find a few recipes that you think your family will enjoy and really, try to make those dishes and make the food inviting, make it tasty. And the sledgehammer approach, it just doesn't work. It creates a lot of tension. And even though it's so tempting, like trust me, I know it's so tempting, but I have never found it to be a long-term solution. I think it has to be, you've used this word a lot, which is one of my favorite words, which is curiosity. So using curiosity about like what your kids might be interested in, inviting them to participate, and definitely don't be the sledgehammer because it just doesn't work. And honestly, it turns you into the kind of parent that you're not striving to be, right? You want to feel connected and you want that nourishment piece of it, which definitely doesn't come with a sledgehammer.
It's so true. And we could probably have you come back and we could do a whole beautiful podcast on just that one topic of making that transition. And I'm kind of in my own discovery phase with this podcast as to what it wants to be. One thing we share is a love of farmers markets. And I'm curious, at what point in your life did you start going to markets and how does it influence your cooking choices?
So before we moved to California, we lived in Cleveland and we did not have year-round farmers markets. And even the farmers markets that we had in the summertime, it was wonderful. I love seeing the produce, but I was never a regular farmers market goer because I still had to do so much of my grocery shopping elsewhere. And it was sort of like a little almost like a touristy kind of thing. Oh, let's go to the market and might pick up a couple things. It's really when we moved to California. And this is I'm 100% spoiled, but we have, and I felt like my farmer's market experience in California has been sort of like, I'm like Goldilocks, like this one was too small, this one was too big. And then I finally found the one that felt like it was like the perfect fit. And so now pretty much any Sunday that I'm in town, I am at the farmer's market and I do a good bulk of my shopping at the farmer's market. And I've gotten to know like some of the vendors and, I love like chatting with them and, they teach me so much about how I could use a certain ingredient. And I feel very, very connected to my farmer's market. So it's definitely been a California thing. And I just love going every single week. It's my favorite thing.
My husband says it's my therapy. Part of my therapy is that my mood always is elevated and improved. Even if I'm in a good mood, I'm in a great mood.
Yeah.
And if I'm in a not so good mood, I'm in a better mood.
I think it's definitely just like the abundance of what you see and just like being able to sort of like, experience that. But then it's also like throughout the week, knowing that I have all of this like wonderful food. That's just, yeah.
It's the best, isn't it?
It's the best. It's the best.
Well, tell us a little bit. You've alluded to some conferences and workshops. Is there anything that you're really excited about this year that we all might like to also go to? Tell us if you know of any interesting conferences or things that are piquing your interest.
The most recent conference I went to was at the end of last year. I went to the American College of Lifestyle Medicine. I feel like my conference going was disrupted by COVID a little bit. I think for all of us, we weren't really doing all those things. So that's the most recent one that I went to. I don't have any other upcoming conferences. To be honest, the thing that I really loved the most about that conference, there were a handful of really amazing talks, but the thing that was like probably the most invigorating and exciting to me was just getting to meet so many people who I knew in person, people who I had sort of met virtually. And that part for me, just connecting with other like-minded people. The American College of Lifestyle Medicine has a pediatric interest group, and those group of pediatricians are just the warmest, kindest, most compassionate people. And it was just wonderful to be in a room with all of these amazing clinicians that are, in their own ways doing phenomenal things, whether it's in their communities or through education. And so I think for me, that's the highlight of going to these conferences now.
It's really that collaborative community. And I think that is, especially if you are not in academic environments anymore, you're a little more siloed in your clinical expression, whether it's coaching or administrative roles. I think it's so great to be connected to the larger, vibrant body of people, nourishing other people in all the ways that they do. How can people find you online? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I am on Instagram. So it's just my name, Reshma Shah. And then I actually have 2 websites. I'm kind of navigating these new waters, but my main website is just my name, reshmashahmd.com. And you can find some information about my book and some recipes on there. And then my newest venture, my parent coaching, it's a very clever title. It's Reshma Shah MD Parent Coaching. And if you want to get in touch around or find out more about my coaching services, you can find me there. But those are probably and then I'm on LinkedIn and those things, but those are probably the 2 best places.
Our time has sadly come to a close. I'm so happy for this time we've had together, and thank you so much for coming.
Well, it was such a privilege and honor and so much fun to talk with you today.
Thanks, everyone, for joining us this week on our episode. And all of the references from today's episode will be in our show notes. And I hope you really do reach out and follow along with Dr. Shah as she brings these beautiful concepts to life and makes plant-based cooking process enjoyable and with ease so you can nourish yourself. Thanks, everyone.